Hello guys and welcome to another Ford Focus Mark 1 parts information video, episode 5 this time. We've covered obviously the generic sort of bits and pieces, accessories in the first and second episode. Third episode suspension, fourth episode brakes. Fifth episode, what can I talk about? What area? I'm going to talk about sensors because this is something that really regularly comes up and a lot of people ask me questions on what sensors to go for in terms of replacements. I generically say, for just before we start and look at a number of sensors that a Mark 1 uses, I would say one thing. Genuine Ford sensors are extremely expensive and I've only ever bought them if they're at a reasonable price, i.e. a bargain compared to what they normally retail for from Ford Direct. So I wouldn't really think that it would be a good exercise to buy anything directly from Ford unless it was a complete bargain. I would generically go for aftermarket. So that's just something to be kind of aware about before we start. But there are a number of sensors on a Mark 1 and they are failing quite regularly now because they're all of a certain age. They are electronics and electronics eventually age. They break down, heat cycles, depending on where they're situated. But hopefully in this episode I can give you some good advice on where to buy, maybe some parts numbers, but I can't give you too much in the way of parts numbers because a lot of this is aftermarket stuff. But anyway, we're going to start off with a thing that is only fitted to certain Ford Focus Mark 1s. This episode is going to be petrol 1.4, 1.6 Zetec SE, i.e. the Ford Sigma engine, quite heavy today, but this can apply to the 1.82 litre and the diesel models that use a number of these sensors. But you'll just have to research on what the sensors actually look like because the sensors can vary in terms of their appearance. But generically, we'll go and start with this. So as you can see here, guys, this is a mass airflow sensor. And most of you who have a Mark 1 will not have this sensor on your Mark 1. It was only ever fitted, especially in the UK models, I'm not sure about abroad, for the 1.6 automatic models only. The 1.8 litre models, the 2 litre petrol models, this is petrol models by the way, diesel models would not have got this, and the ST170. Every other model, diesels, 1.4, 1.6 manuals, maybe some 1.8 manuals that I've noticed, have map sensors. Now, I'll come to that a bit later because we're going to cover map sensors in a second. But mass airflow sensors do exactly that. They are a hot wire system, a little electrical heated wire, and the air that passes through that wire is measured by that sensor. So basically the amount of air coming in will cool that hot wire down and its resistance will lower, and therefore it will give the ECU a completely different reading based on the amount of resistance. The ECU will calculate the resistance to a certain amount of air coming in and it will use that information to put the correct amount of fuel in the car to get the air fuel mixture balanced at the stoichiometric value, if you know what that is. That is the perfect air fuel mixture ratio. And these sensors are very good at what they do. There's probably a reason why they never fitted them to the majority of lower spec Mark 1s, and that is because they're very expensive sensors. And I think Ford thought that a map sensor was pretty accurate and decent technology to use to get a rough estimate of air. But a mass airflow sensor is usually a little bit more accurate and sophisticated than a map sensor. So that is why I think it's fitted to models that require a little bit more efficiency. 1.6 automatics, I have one of these. And the common thing with these sensors is that they pack up. I've had 3 of these pack up on me in the last 11 years. The original one went after 4 years through an engine light, and it will usually say something in relation to the mass airflow sensor circuit failure. I will tell you something, the air temperature sensor is incorporated into the mass airflow sensor. So there'll be a one hot wire for the mass airflow circuit and there'll be a little tiny one for the air temperature. And the air temperature sensor works exactly the same way. Cold air, resistance, less resistance, ECU will make an interpreted reading off that to determine the air temperature. And actually, the second time I put a mass airflow sensor on, I replaced the original with an aftermarket one, and guess what? That lasted 2 seconds. No, actually it lasted 2 months precisely, and then the light came on again, engine went into limp home mode, and the gearbox decided to, well, it didn't like what was going on. If you have a 1.6 or 2 litre automatic with this mass airflow sensor, which you will have, if you have a problem with this sensor, your gearbox will go into limp home mode and it really will not like it. So I would suggest having a spare one of these hanging around. The parts number is 1072308. 1072308. You'll get plenty of aftermarket ones. Should you go for aftermarket? No. This is one sensor that, due to my experience, you don't buy aftermarket because they don't run right. So the second sensor that I bought to replace the genuine one, it ran okay for a bit, but it felt like going up hills, the car wasn't quite as powerful as what it should be. It felt like it wasn't particularly happy. And then the warning light came on. I was like, oh God, what now? Air temperature circuit malfunction. So the air temperature side of the sensor in the aftermarket one had failed. So again, I had to throw it in the bin. I got my money back for it though, before I did that. It was about £40–50 aftermarket, which is the going rate. Please do not buy ones that cheap, really honestly. And I'll actually give you a story now, which is quite fascinating about the aftermarket ones. I then replaced that one, but I couldn't get a genuine one at the time for reasonable money. The genuine ones are about £250 for good reason. I'd probably say that's good money if they're going to last 15 years, because actually these are really crucial devices and your car will not like it if these go wrong, because it is really, it will put the car into limp home mode, automatic or manual, it doesn't matter. But I replaced that with a more expensive mass airflow sensor, and it was from Febby Bilstein. It was actually branded as a Febby Bilstein mass airflow sensor. Don't buy that one. It's retailing for about £100 currently, and you can identify it. It will have, instead of the original Torque security screws, you'll have blue Phillips screws. They're blue, they're painted blue. Don't buy that one. They are absolute junk. I put that on my car after spending, I think it was £85 at the time, and it ran perfectly fine. It ran a little bit better than what the cheap aftermarket did, but then guess what happened after 7 months? Failed again. The light came on and it said mass airflow sensor fault. I'm livid by this stage. I'm thinking, what do I do? Well, I'll tell you what I did next, and this is something that I'm going to recommend to you guys on this one. Don't buy aftermarket ones. Don't buy brand new ones unless they're less than £100 and someone's selling it because they've bought it but never fitted it to their Mark 1. You know the sort of story. You buy aftermarket ones. You go and get the ones that are second hand, that are working from the breakers. There's plenty online. If you put that parts number in, you'll get plenty of them. And this is the parts number for the 1.4, 1.6, by the way. 1072 308 is the 1.4, 1.6. 1.8 and 2 litre, well, it was never fitted to the 1.4, I'll put it that way. So I'm not quite sure why it ever says it. But the 1.8 2 litre uses a slightly different mass airflow sensor, but they look similar, different parts number. I haven't got that parts number to hand, but do a little bit of research, but you'll find them. They're easy to find. Same for the ST170. Buy a load of second-hand ones, because I bought 3 of them. I've got 3 of them in storage because of how serious this issue is and how badly it could make my engine run and my gearbox. It's that bad. In fact, if it happened on a long distance trip, I'd have to call the AA because the gearbox did not like it whatsoever. It was going into a frenzy, and that's not good for the gearbox. So I would suggest you do that. I fitted a genuine second-hand one, cleaned it up, gave it a bit of a contact spray on the wires, and then put it in, connected it back up, and the car functioned better than it ever done before. I think it functioned better than the original one when I bought the car 11 years ago. So there was clearly something wrong going on for years, and it felt like the car had power. So even the aftermarket ones, They were even the Febby one that I bought, that never ran as well as the genuine one. There's a lot of electronics in that little box. There's a lot of electronics. And I just don't think with something so precise and so neatly manufactured and designed that aftermarket manufacturers can make something as good as Ford. And this is one of those rare parts where I'm going to tell you, go for genuine, because there's nothing better out there. And you don't want your Mark 1 operating poorly. I wonder how many Mark 1s have got cheap aftermarket MAF sensors in their cars. I feel for the owners because they're driving them an absolute dog. Then we come to this, the map sensor. Now this is the map sensor that you would have in a 1.4, 1.6. I can't speak at least for the 1.8 litre models, but most 1.4, 1.6 Focuses and diesel models, it's a slightly different one to this, but they all have a map sensor. It's called a manifold absolute pressure sensor. Manifold absolute pressure sensor. Got it right second time there. Means my words and all that. And these rarely give faults. They are actually very simple boxes. They're tiny. They're nowhere near as sophisticated as MAF sensors, but they do a good job and they will get decent performance out of a Mark 1. I would never ever think, can I convert my Mark 1 from a MAF sensor from a map to a MAF? No, you can't, because the map sensor is located on the inlet manifold. And on my car, because my car has a MAF sensor, not a map, where the map sensor would normally sit on the inlet manifold, it's blanked off. So you would need an entirely different inlet manifold. And secondly, you won't have the wiring. Mark 1s were never fitted with wiring for both map and MAF sensors. So it's just not possible, sadly. Otherwise, I think it would be a worthwhile conversion if it was possible. But they run absolutely fine on these. They give very little issue. They are far cheaper and they are manufactured to good quality if they ever do fail. I've known one or two failures, but not many. They're certainly not as complicated as MAF sensors and therefore are less likely to go wrong, and they rarely go wrong. So it measures the pressure of the air inside the inlet manifold, and that is information again relayed via resistance to the ECU to create a reading. So that's where I'm going to leave that, but they rarely cause issues. Anyway, next one. These sensors, yes, it is a crankshaft position sensor, will leave you stranded if they fail completely. The car will not start. The car, every Mark 1 uses a crank and cam position sensor to relate the timing of the pistons and the engine, okay? To make sure that the ECU knows what's happening with the timing. And when it doesn't have a reference on the crank position sensor side of things, poof, no start. Often when I say my Mark 1 doesn't start, it's got a good battery, it's charged up, all the earth points are good, it's all been serviced, but doesn't start. I've got all the lights, but it won't start. I would look at the crankshaft position sensor, because when they fail completely, your car won't start. However, I have known that they can actually fail intermittently, because somebody many years ago, I had a problem with his Mark 1 where he used to drive round a roundabout, and every time he turned right, the car used to cut out. And I think, what the heck could that be? Turned out, after replacing a load of sensors and the basic stuff like coil packs, etc., he actually found that the crankshaft position sensor, the magnetic casing that you see in that picture that sticks into the flywheel housing to pick up the missing tooth of the flywheel, which is what the pickup will sense, that broke down and it started revealing the sort of magnetic insides, and that was what was causing the fault, basically. You can go for aftermarket ones. They're very cheap. I'd buy a couple of them personally. Have one in the glove compartment. There is one, as I say, when I take my Mark 1 for a long distance trip, I always have that. There's two things I have in my spare box in the back of my car on a long distance trip: a mass airflow sensor and a crankshaft position sensor, because if either of them fail, I'm either going to get a car that's barely running or a car that doesn't run at all. So I would say buy a couple of them, okay, and have them in the glove compartment. Or at least if you've got a working one, have a spare one in the glove compartment. It's easy to take off. It's a small bolt, it's an electrical connector at the back of the engine. Absolutely simple. Honestly, it really isn't hard to change. So please think about that. It will leave you stranded, and they do pack up. And again, this one, this is the bigger, fatter version. It's the camshaft position sensor. Yes. Again, this one is suitable for the 1.4, 1.6. Again, have a look for the 1.82 litre. They will be there, and I suspect that it is also fitted to the diesels. I know the TDCI definitely has them. Again, this is used in conjunction with the crankshaft position sensor to relate the timing and tell the engine where the engine is in terms of its timing position, in terms of notches on the cam, and this will obviously read from a notch on the camshaft itself. It does come with a little O-ring seal because it's in an area of oil, so therefore we need an O-ring to stop oil coming out. I had to replace the camshaft position sensor in my Focus 4. Actually, I've got a genuine one because back in the day, you could actually get genuine ones for reasonable money. And the reason I did that is because the oil sensor, the oil O-ring, had actually started leaking oil down the back of the engine. I only discovered that after actually putting my head up the back of the engine because it's very clean and dry at the back usually on Sigma. And that's the reason I replaced it, not because it was failing. The old one is still in my spares somewhere as a backup. But I don't actually keep this sensor in my boot because if this sensor was to go wrong, your car isn't going to cut out and not work like the crankshaft position sensor. It will just go into limp home mode. It's very different to the crank sensor. Your car will just go into limp home mode and that's it really. It's ideal to have in the boot though as a spare. But again, the parts number for this is 1037465 for the 1416 models. This is a February one. And I'll probably recommend this. They're very cheap. They're probably about 12 to 15 quid, like the crankshaft position sensor. Makes sense to actually change them both in pairs. I really would recommend it. They fail just as much as the crankshaft position sensors. And the next one is the throttle position sensor. Now, I've noticed in the last few years there have been a few problems with these, particularly where they actually wear on the track. It is a moving part and they do wear out a little bit over the years and become slightly less accurate. They are cheap enough. Again, another 15 quid. The aftermarket ones are okay. They can be a bit funny though when you're trying to get the electrical connector over. They could be a bit tight, the aftermarket ones. I've got a few genuine ones, second-hand ones. If you want to get some genuine second-hand ones, go for it, but only really get them off low mileage Mark 1s if you see them in the breakers or whatever. If it's come off a high mileage Focus, that's going to be more wear on the throttle position sensor, so you might as well buy an aftermarket one. They rarely fail, but they do wear out and they become less accurate. So if you're having some running issues, I wouldn't discount something like this. In fact, I'd just change it for the sake of changing. It's been 15 quid, come on, you know. So that's just something to bear in mind there. The other one as well is the coolant temperature sensor. This is really important, this sensor. So on all the petrol models and the diesel models, it will go in a blind hole in the cylinder head. On the petrol models, it goes between spark plugs 2 and 3. Okay, it goes straight in there and it is to measure the actual, it's actually not the coolant, strangely enough. It's actually wrong because most manufacturers say it's coolant temperature sensor. It's actually not. It's the engine temperature sensor or a cylinder head temperature sensor, the CHTS. Oh yes, I got that one right. And they do fail. Usually the sign that they fail is by, if you're on the petrol models especially, take the number 3 spark plug out and then try and push the connector off the actual sensor, which is difficult with your fingers, but try and hook it up. That connector can sometimes snap, but they still clip down, but the actual tab snaps because of the heat from the engine. It gets to the connector and they get a bit brittle, but just push it up, start the car. The engine cooling fan should start running straight away. If it doesn't, that's either a faulty fan or the temperature sensor was at fault. I would say so. But anyway, that's really my technique for doing that. But they can throw up a code sometimes. They can become inaccurate. And I definitely think it's worth changing if you're getting the rocker cover off. If you're changing, let's say, the rocker cover gasket, I would actually, since you've got access, change the temperature sensor. And then you've got, you know, a good accurate reading. The ECU goes off the reading that this gives the ECU, and it will use that information to adjust fuel air mixture, whether turn the fans on or not, etc. So it is a good test, but usually they don't ever throw a code. but it's worth buying because they're about 10, 15 quid again. You know, these things will make a Mark 1 more efficient because the original items are great. They've lasted 15, 20 plus years, but they're all getting old now and it's worth changing. Now we're on to something that frequently fails on a lot of gearboxes, and it is actually this in the picture. Most of you will know that that is the speed sensor. Now these speed sensors, they go at the back of the gearbox, very close to actually the crankshaft position sensor. They are fitted to all the petrol models, and I believe the diesel models also get them at the back as well. You will have to just make sure that you are buying the right one for your car, but the one in the picture is for the petrol models. They will come with a pin. The pin sometimes seizes in the gearbox and WD-40 and twiddling with some pliers. Be very gentle, you don't want that pin snapping. A best option is to actually just really honestly soak it in WD, keep wiggling, be patient, and it will come out. And then you can pull the sensor out. It's as simple as that. Comes with a couple of O-rings. They can leak actually out the O-rings, and they can completely fail. And the major symptom of the speed sensor failing is that the car will just cut out, but before then, the speedo will go to zero. The speedo will just randomly, you're going at 30 miles an hour, it will drop to zero, and then the car will cut out. Why? Well, it's because the speedo sensor has started to fail, and it's telling the car, well, telling the ECU, I should say, that the car is not doing anything. It's not travelling. It's 0 miles an hour, i.e. idle speed. So the ECU thinks, oh, we're travelling, we're not actually moving at all. So we'll just go to the fuel mixture settings for idle speed. So it will just lower the idle and think, oh, hold on, this is wrong. And then because the ECU is not providing the car for sufficient fuel to travel at 30 miles an hour because it thinks it's idling, the car cuts out. So essentially the speedo sensor is confusing the ECU and making it think that the car is not moving when it is moving, and that's why your car cuts out. So I would recommend, that's the major symptom. If your car is cutting out but the speedo is remaining the same, it's not dropping to zero at all, it's not the speedo sensor. So it is something else. Possibly crankshaft position sensor, like I've said. It is a number of these sensors. They're all interconnected. They all work together to provide you with an efficient Mark 1. But they are cheap. You can go for aftermarket ones, not a problem. 15, 20 quid, again, not too much of a bother. Don't go for the cheapest. 15, 20 quid as usual. And that is where I'm going to leave this episode, because I know we're going on for about 22 minutes here, and I want to keep this episode kind of short, concise. Make sure you get all the information you need, nothing more. So hopefully this has helped you find what your issue with your Mark 1 could be. A lot of Mark 1s are having sensor related issues, and even multiple ones, and sometimes it's difficult to know which one it could be. So hopefully I've given you some information as to what it could possibly be. It is a tricky one because Mark 1s have got very dumb ECUs. They only really throw a code and give you some inkling as to what's going on when something has actually failed, not when it's failing. When it's in that scenario, it won't put any sort of light on really. You'll just get a symptom and you'll be scratching your head as to what it would be. So don't rely on a check warning code and engine warning light coming on, because that's just the way things are with the Mark 1s. And at the end of the day, it's all about trying to save money, but trying to get as much usability as possible and to make these cars as functional for you as possible. And hopefully I've given you some insight into what to avoid, especially that FEBI MAF sensor. I try and tell people what they should go for rather than what they should avoid, and that is one to definitely avoid based on my experience. I've had a cheap and expensive MAF sensor aftermarket, and neither of them work properly. So there's a word of warning. MAF sensors, get genuine, get second-hand ones. The rest, you can go for aftermarket, but good aftermarket, please. And you should sort many problems out with replacing a lot of sensors, and everything will be reading correctly. So the ECU is receiving accurate information, and it can actually make the car run a heck of a lot better. It can only do what it's given. If it's told that there are 2 lots of air coming into the car, then it will produce the amount of fuel required for 2 lots of air. But it actually, if that sensor is saying, oh no, there's actually 5 lots of air when there's actually 2, that could cause a bit of a problem. So make sure that If there is a problem, or if you think there's a problem, just swap it out. It's really cheap, and you're going to get a Mark 1 that will have so much accurate information going to that ECU, you will feel the difference behind the wheel. Take care, guys. See you very soon in another episode.